Okay, so as quickly as possible, I'm going to try to complete the other side of my robot. Now, I'm not going to add all of the details in this presentation. I'll continue to work on this, and I'll show you the final model when it's done. But for now, I want to just work as quickly as possible to kind of wrap this uh, the basic concept of the robot up. Now, before I do, I'm going to add a little bit more stuff, and so I really want to organize my object manager, and so I'm going to start to group some things together. I'm going to start by collapsing uh, all of the hierarchies that are open by have a plus sign and a minus sign. If I hit the minus sign, it turns into a plus sign. So I'm just collapsing the hierarchy for each one of the objects, and so now I got a pretty clear idea of what objects, what the individual objects are. So I have a body object, and then there's all these other, body 1 and body 2. That's because I copied the object. So I'm going to shift click and select body 1 and body 2. And I could move these down, and I could group body 1, 2, and 3 together as the torso object. I also might just be able to select the body 1 and 2 and drop it in the body object. There are some advantages and disadvantages to doing that, but for the sake of this model, I can always go back and re-engineer that if I re-engineer that relationship if I feel like that's not going to give me what I want. So I want the head, I want the eyes at least to be part of the head. So I have this array and this head 1. Again, I didn't name these objects, and maybe I'll go back and while I'm organizing these, I'll start naming these to remind myself what they are. But in some cases, I can just take the bolts and this head 2 object, which is actually the band that runs with the bolts, and I can really make that all part of the eye object. Okay, so now the eye is all of that stuff. I have the eye and the head. The eye feels like it should belong to the head. So now when I select the head and I move the head, all that stuff goes with it. Okay, and I'll consider what my hierarchy is for the body, the neck, and the head here in just a bit. But I wanted to do a quick cleanup, and I think that I achieved more or less what I wanted to with the cleanup. Now, I'll continue to shuffle some things around here in a bit, but for now, as I mentioned before, I just want to try to wrap up the leg of my robot. And so I'll do a couple of cheats. Not really a cheat, I'll just be as efficient as possible. I'm going to create a brand new cylinder. I'm going to orient this one along X. And I'm going to use this more or less as kind of the attachment for my leg object. So, and I didn't thoroughly realize this in the sketch, and so I'm just kind of designing by the seat of my pants here, but I think that I'll be able to come up with something decent here. And as I'm designing this, I'm realizing that whatever this bottom cylinder is, and I really lucked out by clicking on it, and I was able to select it. It's body 2. I'm going to call this lower body. So if I need to dig back in and select it, I'll be able to do that. I'm just going to make some adjustments in the design here. I want that to be much smaller. Okay, so that makes this lower part of the body a little bit more interesting. Not only that, if I continue to make that radius a little bit smaller, that gives me some more opportunities to adjust the size of the cylinder that I just created. So my goal is to get this cylinder, its height, a little bit lower, which will make it a little bit more narrow. Okay, and that's pretty much what I'm going for. And I'll make some adjustments a little bit later, but again, I don't want to over-design this here. I'm going to take a sphere, and I'm going to adjust that radius. Okay, and again, I could make sure that these objects are lined up. I will use the technique of selecting the cylinder and the sphere, and I'll go to Functions, Center, and I just want to center it along the y-axis. When I hit Apply, that ensures that they're lined up perfectly. So I'm going to find that sphere, and I'm going to select it. I'll Command C and Command V to duplicate it, and what I want to do is I want to move this on the other side of the cylinder, and because everything is oriented along that y-axis, so pretty much we have Everything over here on the left side is in the negative X, and everything on the right side is going to be in the positive X. And so because I have a duplicate, I got a little technique that I can just get rid of the minus sign on one of the axes, and that just moves it symmetrically over to the other side. So that's kind of that lower, these are kind of the hips of the robot, and there might come a point where I want to articulate the hips different from the upper body, and so so maybe I'll select all this stuff and I'll group it, and I'll just call this lower body. I realized that I borrowed that term over here, but maybe instead of body I'll call this torso or upper body. Might as well be consistent with the caps and the lowercase. So I'll call that upper body and lower body, and that's looking pretty good. So now I have the arm, or what I called the arm, and I might as well call that arm. That's getting a little confusing, so maybe I'll call this upper arm. And now I have this lower arm, and I have the upper arm and the lower arm, and those are two objects that I could just really quickly reuse for the legs. I'll want to change the size and the shape of them a little bit. But before I do that, I do want to consider the way that these things are going to attach to the object, and the way that they're going to be arranged hierarchically. Now remember, in the lamp project, we did some arrangement of the axis, or the center point of the axis, so that when we rotate these things, it rotates around a logical connection point. So if I grab rotation and I have the upper arm selected, and I rotate that, it rotates around the center of the object, not at all what we want. And so I'm going to do a little bit of adjustment here. I'm going to go into the Move tool, and I'm going to make sure that I have the Use Object Axis tool selected, and I'll slide the axis over. This is not something that I want to just simply eyeball in a perspective view. I'm going to be a little bit more precise about this, and I'm going to do this from the front view. Okay, and so with the front view selected, I'm going to tap the S key, which allows me to zoom in. And that sphere right there, that's kind of my shoulder socket. So it's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on, but I can see that this is the center line for the sphere. I'm assuming that this is the body. This is part of the torso here, this line. And in fact, if I go to display and I'll do constant shading with lines, that didn't help. Maybe quick shading with lines. There we go. I get a better sense of how this model is, what I have selected and what this model looks like. This is my shoulder socket here that I have selected. That's the thing that I'm adjusting and aligning my axis to. I'm pretty close, so I'll just move that there. And now I'll go back to the perspective view. If I go back to the Use Model tool, and now I go into Rotate, now when I rotate that, part, it rotates according to where its shoulder is. Okay, exactly what I wanted. Now, as far as the lower arm, I want to do the same thing. I want to make sure I go to the Move tool. I'm going to move the axis, and I want to move it. I want to move this over to where I think it should rotate, and you'll notice that when I try to move the axis, I get some really weird stuff happening. That's actually kind of cool. That'd be kind of cool to animate that effect. Okay, and that's just the effect of the cylinder moving in through that bulge and taper. Let me undo that. The reason I cannot move the axis, if you remember, if we go into a new document, if I keep something as a parametric primitive and I go into the Use Axis mode, when I move it, it still moves the model itself. It's only once I make it editable that I can move the axis. Okay, that's a little trick we have to keep in mind. Now, the problem with that is, in my case, my robot, the parent object, that upper arm object, that lower arm object is a cylinder. Okay, it's a parametric primitive that happens to have a bulge and a taper in it. I got a couple of different objects, or a couple of different options. I could make that arm editable, but then I don't have the benefit of this being a parametric primitive that I can modify these different parameters. My technique is I'm going to select the lower arm object. Okay, just have the lower arm parent object selected. I'm going to go to Objects, I'm going to group that individual object. It might seem strange to group an object because I only had one object selected effectively, but what that does is it takes now a null object, and we'll call this lower arm, and I'll just call this lower prim for lower primitive. So that lower arm object now is simply just a null object, or it's a group. So it's a container that contains all that other stuff. And the nice thing about a null object, you can see that little icon, that's the icon for null object. The nice thing about a null object is that you don't have to make it editable to move its axis. Okay, so again, I just took a standard primitive object and I grouped it onto itself. That nested it inside a null object. And the benefit of a null object is that you don't have to make it editable to move its axis. You can move its axis. So what I'll do is I'm going to flatten out my view, and I'll look at the front view of this object, and now I'm just going to move that axis over, and I'm really just kind of looking to line up that rotation point of the lower arm. Now when I'm way zoomed in here, I didn't really catch this. I didn't catch this in my perspective view, and you can see the advantage of looking at this through a really flat, precise view. Let me maximize that. If I look at my arm here, you can see that my arm cylinder actually doesn't run into my sphere, so I get this little edge here, and it's not really a big deal, but while I'm here, I might as well fix it. So that was my upper arm, and you can see that, you know, with all of these objects now, my hierarchy is getting a little confusing. So I'm going to go into my upper arm. I want to grab that cylinder. I want to make sure I go back to the Use Model tool, and now I'll just kind of slide that over. And when I try to slide it over, I don't actually have enough room to move that over, so I'll just make it a little bit bigger. There we go. Now I could move it over if I want to. That looks pretty good. Okay, and I'll collapse the upper arm hierarchy. So while I was in that nice flat view, I was able to make some adjustments. So now if I go back out to my perspective view, and I go to rotate, and I grab the lower arm. If I rotate that lower arm, it rotates around the socket of the upper arm. So now we almost have the whole arm solution rigged. We have a lower arm, lower arm, and if I rotate that, it rotates. But if I grab the upper arm and I move the upper arm, we got a little problem in our a little mechanical problem with our robot. And so what we can do is simply take the lower arm and make it a child of the upper arm. And so now when I grab the upper arm and I move that, the lower arm goes with it. I'll undo, grab the lower arm, and when I rotate that, I can leave that in whatever position I want. Now I can grab the upper arm and I can move that into any position that I want. Okay, so that's going to be the parent-child relationship that I want to use. The upper arm is the parent of the lower arm once I get that relationship established, and that'll give me the ability to pose this thing and really kind of treat it like a character. Okay, just like we did with the lamp project. Now, my goal was to take the upper arm and all of its components, and I'll just copy and paste it, and I'll take that object, that exact duplicate, and I'll move it down. Okay, so this is ultimately going to be my leg object. I'm just kind of moving that down. Again, I'm just going to eyeball this really quickly. I'll stick it right there on the side, and now I'll rotate this thing 90 degrees that way. Okay, and obviously I'll have to, like, you know, change a few things over here, or maybe not. Maybe I'll just leave it just like that. That's fine. I mean, in terms of the way that it's connecting here, I actually think I can live with that. That'll work for now. I might change a little bit later, but I think that'll do the trick. So now the only problem is that leg, because it's the exact same size as the arm, to me is reading really kind of strange. So first thing I want to do is I don't want to leave this thing called upper arm, because now it's a leg. So I'll change it to upper leg, and I now have this lower arm. I'll change that to lower leg, and it's actually this lower leg object. That's where that cylinder is. So I'm just going to take the whole lower object, and I could take that primitive and just make the height bigger. Okay, And you can see that it's kind of falling outside of those deformations that we applied. So now we got to go inside and we got to find the bulge, and we got to adjust the size of the bulge. So we have this bulge bounding box, and it's an XYZ value. So if I find the Y value, I could make that taller. Alternatively, what I could do is I could change the mode of this, the bulge from limited. I believe if I set that to unlimited, that'll adjust the way that the bulge is affected. Now, it's not exactly what I wanted, so I might undo that. And I'll even undo a little bit more to get it back to its original shape. I got a lot of different options to adjust this. I'm going to try I'm going to first try for the easiest option. And that first option is going to be to grab the lower cylinder here. I'll just scale the whole thing up. Okay. Now the only difference is that I just need to move that back down so that it kind of lines up with that original socket that I created. So it's really all about just, you know, finding these parts and figuring out what you want to do with them. Make that a little bit bigger. Make it feel like it should support the weight of the leg. Now, when I scaled that up, the obvious problem with my leg is that if I were to duplicate that and, you know, kind of move that over and attach it to the other side, I got a problem that my legs will kind of bump and rub together. And I could take care of that. There's a number of ways that I can take care of that. One would be just to kind of move this whole setup over just a little bit. Another would be to adjust the radius of the leg. So I'm going to continue to tweak those. That's really, you know, there's going to be a lot of stuff that we have to do to get the proportion right, because that's going to be a really important quality. But basically, just using the arm and reconfiguring the proportion of the leg, I think, is going to go a long way to creating this object. So I'm gonna continue to push this forward, just to kind of, you know, get a few more details worked out. I'm not going to worry about my jaw just yet. I think I have everything that I need to, aside from the details and the nuance of this thing, to really kind of focus on the next steps in the project. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.